Welcome back to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and insurance meet. This is the latest special episode produced in association with Mosaic Insurance. Our theme is History Matters, and so does ignoring it. I'm your host, David Benyon. I'm joined by special guests Charlie Mackay from Mosaic and Robert Hunter. Charlie Mackay is an Executive Vice President at Mosaic Insurance and its Chief Underwriting Officer International, based in London. Charlie drives global market engagement strategy, overseeing global broker relationships and driving global market engagement strategy, tactics and execution. Previously, he served as an active underwriter at Mosaic and also an active underwriter at Pembroke Syndicate 4000. He spent more than 20 years working in the Lloyd's market. Robert Hunter was US Ambassador to NATO between 1993 and 98, and was a lead architect and principal negotiator of the new NATO at the end of the Cold War. In the Carter administration, he was lead official on the National Security Council staff for Europe and then the Middle East. He was Senator Edward Kennedy's first foreign policy advisor, and was an official in the LBJ White House, working in education policy. He has more than 1,500 publications, has taught at 5 universities, and received the Pentagon's top civilian award twice and the French Légion d'honneur. He took part in 9 presidential campaigns and has written speeches for more presidential candidates, 13, than anyone else in US history. Robert recently wrote an article, History Matters, published by the Ambassador Partnership and by American Diplomacy. In it, he argues that for decades, the political leaders and geopolitical advisors around them responsible for directing American foreign policy have succumbed to complacency, ignoring the lessons provided by a strong grasp of history. This one was a lot of fun to record. The aim here is to take the picture that Robert paints in his History Matters article, the mess of American foreign policy, and particularly the unpredictability that characterises the current administration, and to address some of the challenges facing Western multinationals that are seeking specialty insurance protection for risks to their businesses, such as political risk and political violence, amidst a volatile and uncertain operating environment. Enjoy the episode. Robert, Charlie, very big welcome to the pod. Lovely to speak to you both.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Robert's recent article, History Matters, I guess it's the reprise of geopolitical risk, right? This is, I think, just a great core for the conversation. You stress the impact on US foreign policy making of having a sound historical understanding, or the lack thereof. For business leaders faced by the situation that you write about in your article, are there a few broad assumptions that we can draw about what we can or we can't expect from US foreign policy now or in the near future?
If I knew that, I would know where to invest today and make a little money tomorrow. Let's put it this way. During the Cold War, there were some reasonable assumptions about the global environment, that the United States really only had 3 policies. One was to extend the Soviet Union, defeat communism, and lead a growing global economy. And the strategy of doing that was more or less understood. Well, Cold War comes to an end, and we thought we had won. And then people said history would come to an end. What we say goes. President George Bush said that. And the world is our oyster. Now, one of the things that happened, however, 2 things that happened. One is people stopped thinking clearly or even adequately about what was really going on in the world, because we didn't need it as much. We weren't about to be destroyed with nuclear weapons. And secondly, a lot of countries that had sheltered under the American wing, I'm talking allies, didn't have to do so anymore. They could start thinking for themselves, doing for themselves. And the combination of these 2 factors, and I would say in particular the lack of confidence in what America is going to be doing, makes it more difficult for anybody in the commercial business world to do enough forward planning. I know there's the old saw about just looking for the quarterly profits, at least in this country. But if you're going to do a lot of investments and do a lot of organization for trade, you've got to have some kind of sense of what the world's going to be like in a longer time frame. And whether anybody likes it or not, where the United States stands in regard to global politics, and even now, to a great extent in global economics, is unrivaled. But that also means that confidence in what the United States leadership, both public, which kind of changed a lot, and private, where there's probably more sense of the long term, matters a lot. Because if there is uncertainty, and right now there is more uncertainty about the United States and the world, at least as perceived, than we have seen probably since the 1930s.
I'll turn to Charlie. So, for someone whose business is to underwrite risk for organizations, I'm thinking about Western multinationals active in developing countries, places that do pose significant political risk, maybe threat of political violence, that kind of thing. Organizations that are making strategy and taking decisions in that operating environment. Are there some specific examples or practical examples when you've observed these challenges being played out in the risk landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an industry, our job is to take risk and facilitate investment. We then step through that and have to manage those accumulations. Now, that requires us to constantly test our portfolios for all of the what ifs. And as Robert has referenced, a strong sense of historical context and imagination is crucial to doing that. The things we're ensuring, political risk, political and violence, those events shouldn't happen very often. But if they do, we'd expect the outcome of that and the impact of those on our clients to be severe. The most obvious example, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'd been given a citer of that in terms of the events in 2014. We then had tanks lining up on the border, and this falling back on our recent historical experience that tells us there are no longer land wars in Europe is, of course, incredibly dangerous. And that's what we should be doing as an industry, is thinking about those problems and offering a solution to those potential problems. I guess the lessons there are clear, I think, is we have to be imagining all of these potential outcomes, really challenging ourselves around those what ifs. And then, when we come across scenarios that have either never happened before or outside our recent experience, we should be really cautious around taking too much comfort from those. None of that is to say we should be walking away from risk. We should just be thinking about it and testing it and having solutions that work for our clients and our capital providers.
Former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who some people may remember, someone said to him once, "Prime Minister, what do you most worry about?" He said, "Events, dear boy, events."
Quite right.
Yeah, there's always the unexpected.
But there's unexpected, and then there's, if we think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can read Putin's essays telling us he's going to do that. But I think there's a complacency, following this long, benign period of geopolitical risk that Robert's referring to.
I would ask, however, with regard to the business community, how much change there really is with regard to that. Clearly, if you're in the armaments business, you'll know that this is a time in which there's going to be more spending and more innovation and a lot of other things. And just look at the stock market, which is not the same as what you do. Various armaments firms are doing much better. Now, I think it is, however, at the same time, a reasonable assumption that the Western allies, including the United States, are not going to allow Ukraine to go under and are going to do what's hopefully necessary to keep the Russians from pushing beyond Ukraine, at least in any military physical sense. But at the same time, if you're in a business that's related to energy, certain areas of high technology, certain other things that affect the Baltic states' economies, the Central European states' economies, even, let's say, the German economy, you're going to have more difficult computations to make because you don't know exactly what may happen in the AI sphere in terms of Russian aggression.
That's absolutely right, Robert. And I certainly wouldn't want to, as a seller of insurance, characterize risk and uncertainty as bad things, as so often those are the connotations that go with those words. Is risk and uncertainty present opportunity. And that's where our industry is supposed to step in and help support exploring what those are and how change can lead to opportunity for businesses.
Robert, We hear all the time about President Trump following a transactional approach to foreign policy. It's become a bit cliche in the last couple of years, but your article suggests that that's really just one facet, of a much wider challenge of the US becoming more unpredictable on the world stage.
Let me look at it in two ways. Number one, the United States is a huge country. Number two, we have certain inherent interests. That's even hard for a president to pull apart, even if he wanted to it. So betting on the future of the United States is still a pretty good bet. You may have to pick and choose. You may have to look at long-term versus short-term. But it is clear that President Trump's, as you say, transactional approach, he will, for example, cause some perturbations in Britain with regard to tariffs and the like. But then he gets invited to Windsor for a second state visit, and suddenly he decides the tariffs are going to come down. Well, those are transactions on tariffs, but there are perturbations, and people don't know how long are they going to last. And I would say, not being in your business, if I had a framework which would say, what are the areas of high, medium-term predictability, I would have to short the United States government a moment, at least as the President of the United States is able to organize it. Because if you go from 100% tariffs on certain things from China, and then you have a phone call and you drop down to 35%, or if you go with Canada, you go to 50% and you drop to 10%, a company may be able to work on inventories and say, oh, well, that's just Trump and we can figure that out. But there's an underlying sense of unease about whether he will be able to continue doing that, whether he'll be stopped. And he's got another, in 2029, assuming his health holds on, to be president.
I completely share your view with that. And I think, as you say, the US matters and countries and businesses are having to respond to that. For me, the more sort of medium concern in terms of that impact on US influence is that this inconsistent, strategically erratic behavior encourages both countries and businesses to seek more predictability elsewhere, whether that is with China or creating new groups and new blocks.
I don't worry about new blocks. It's hard to think of a bloc that can operate in the private sector, the public sector, that excludes the United States. I mean, we're just too big. And even though we have an erratic president, we've got an awful lot of people taking decisions in this country. I look, for example, at the debate about artificial intelligence. That is going to be very important in the future, no matter who the United States president is. And calculations made about that may have to do with whether there's a bubble or not a bubble, but certain things are going to be happening. In the energy sector, it is obvious, even though the United States and Russia and China are boycotting the meeting in Brazil of a COP30 or whatever it's called at the moment, the climate change issue isn't going to go away. We can pretend it's not there, but it's going to become ever more important. If I had to look at places of greatest uncertainty, it wouldn't be necessarily the Middle East, because conflict or not, the United States is going to be concerned about the flow of oil, as will everybody else. Short of America's getting killed and everything going bust, that's our real concern. With regard to Europe, it's Russia not being able to disrupt what the European Union does, trade across the Atlantic. Those are really fundamental. The real questions, I think, relate to China. What will they be doing? Because they are not a puny power or a second-rate power, even like Russia. They have calculations that they're making and are trying to be something of a replacement to the United States, not just a competitor. Whether that has any legs or not, I'm something of a skeptic, but then I'm not putting my money on the line with regard to China.
Do you think that unpredictability, does that help or hinder the Chinese in terms of how they plan for their next steps?
Well, I don't know how they do the planning. Everybody says we think in days and they think in centuries. Come on. Now that they have gone beyond Mao, et cetera, and are operating a social capital country. They have to live in the real world and they have to make short-term calculations as well. The one thing I suspect, not having talked to President Xi, and he hasn't come for tea lately, not since he was a high school student in America. Does everybody know that? He was an exchange student. I think they're saying, how do we take advantage of the United States being the last confident for people place of last resort, impacting, let's say, on the role of the dollar? How much are people going to hedge in other instruments, not with the rim value replacing a dollar? That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. People go to the gold standard before that happens. But in terms of, will countries be less confident that the United States will be there on the day, and therefore maybe doing more longer-term business with China, where they start in their come-on approach and then later become predatory, maybe even more predatory than the challenges that are sometimes made to capitalism.
We've talked a lot about unpredictability and erosion of trust in the way we can expect the US to act, and then how other countries are responding to that, whether it's through developing other blocks or however they might want to proceed. What about for business? So, Charlie, for business, particularly US and Western multinationals doing business far beyond the US or the West itself, so let's say sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia Pacific, how is that uncertainty impacting the business world?
As we've discussed, uncertainty is incredibly unhelpful for businesses as they plan and invest. With the terms unprecedented uncertainty are sort of bounded around frequently. And I think to Robert's point, the levels of uncertainty that we're seeing today are not unprecedented or unparalleled in broader historical context. But it's certainly impacting businesses. We've seen some of that over the course of 2025 on the back of the introductions of tariffs and then the various changing tariff rates through our transactional liability book, where insurance hasn't been able to mitigate that risk because deals are not being done because the uncertainty from tariffs mean that buyers and sellers are unable to value those business. But the perception of political risk, I think both real and imagined, has been rising over a number of years. If you look at global risk management surveys, political risk and uncertainty are now in the top 10 in terms of risks that the risk managers are focused on. And those are projected to continue to increase over the coming years. And that's absolutely translating into demand for our products. When I joined the market, the political risk market 25 years ago, the product was increasingly being viewed as a luxury buy. And that was because we were in a period of benign activity from a geopolitical point of view. But as we've been discussing, I think perhaps that period is looking much more like an aberration. And the period we're going into, looking at broader, longer historical timeframes is certainly more uncertain and, more challenging for businesses as they look ahead and invest.
Thinking with an insurance market view or looking from within the insurance market, we're used to thinking in terms of supply and demand. And a lot of these lines of business are very competitive, in fact. So to the industry's own reasons, for its own internal dynamics of oversupply of capacity, to something like political violence is a competitive line of business and you actually see rates falling. But it sounds like if you put that to one side for a moment, that's due to the internal dynamics of the insurance world, the supply of capacity. The demand has grown then. So they're no longer products of luxury, they are more widely bought.
Absolutely. I think that, there's always been an element of the purchase of these products that's been linked to gaining access to financing or indeed reducing the cost of financing by having insurance products to mitigate risk. But, we'd say for the last 5 years, we've seen that real risk rise and we've seen losses come through the markets from various different events. But there's a really broad global profile if you look to the parts of the world that the market has paid claims from, over the last 5 to 7 years. And that is much broader and wider than it was from the preceding 5 or 7 years and the preceding 5 or 7 years before that.
Let me draw a distinction, if I could. in terms of buying your products. Between the perturbations that are going on now, and as you say, they're not necessarily unprecedented, may be different, but there have been other eras in which uncertainty has been a rule, certainly the late 1930s. So if I come to you and I want you to insure me against something that might happen on tariffs and what I can put on a ship and take off the ships, et cetera, versus what I believe to be the longer-term dynamics of the global economy, which is growth, which is the United States still being a huge player, China being a huge player, but lacking the total arsenal of components, which are an open economy, a functioning economy, with some relationship between the domestic and the international stimulus about what they may do militarily and what their reputation is in the world. I don't know whether, in terms of the range of projects you're having to look on, are people really heavily balancing towards, give me some short-term insurance, because in the future, I have a high degree of confidence. After all, we may forget a lot about history, but there are a lot of smart people out there other than the American geopolitical community, which has been asleep at the switch, not as much as where you actually put your money on the table. We've been able to figure this kind of stuff out. And I'm going to segue, maybe this is too early a day for it, to how all of this relates to the so-called business cycle. Have we abolished the business cycle? And what about shocks to it? As we record here today, the United States Supreme Court is trying to decide whether Trump's behavior on tariffs are constitutional. You would think that he has a vote on the Supreme Court, but the degree of questioning as a judgment, like Ouija boards or flipping coins or playing dominoes, seems to be in the direction of some skepticism. That is what he's doing constitutional. And you may notice that the Congress of the United States, which in theory has control over large chunks of America's role in the outside world, in addition to the most important player, maybe even more than the President of the United States, is the Federal Reserve Board, where Chairman Powell has at least several more months before he gets defenestrated by the calendar. People worry about, to go back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. Now, most people never heard of it outside of your business. That's when the United States shut down our economy, the outside world, and created the global Great Depression. People, at least in Congress, or not all of them are brain dead, saying, hey, we don't want to do this. And how do we keep the president from reinforcing something in the business cycle, something on worries about there's going to be a massive export of what may be perturbations in the U.S. economy? I was just wondering how in your business the clients coming to you divide in terms of help me through the emergency room as opposed to help me in long-term care insurance.
Rob, I think you're exactly right. In terms of almost all of what we do in thinking of our relationship with our clients and what we're trying to offer them, it is about that central, medium, long range investment that they're looking to make, which is, to your earlier point about the US over the medium, over the long term is a good bet. And so that's the basis on which effectively our partnership with our partners is to say, this is where you as a client are going to, that is why you're making this investment. These are your assumptions. But there is a tremendous risk to you around all of the deviations that may go between now and that ultimate journey, or where you're ultimately taking that investment. And the insurance is there to take out those remote, unlikely, but possible events that may disrupt that investment or cause a business financial harm. What we're almost always not doing is saying there is a very real likelihood of loss in the very short foreseeable future. Your house isn't quite on fire yet, but the one next door is, and we, the client, would like some insurance. Now, that's not what we're there for. And we can be reactive to, as an industry, we can be reactive to high risk situations. And the Lloyd's market have had an initiative to support grain being traded in and out of Ukraine over the last few years, which I think falls into that category of recognizing extreme risk, but seeking to support clients through that.
Going back to the original premise of Robert's article about contextual knowledge and history, how much do you think that matters in an underwriting perspective? Because some of the lines of business that you do at Mosaic, specialty lines, something like war risk insurance or political violence, it's not rich in data or analytics or mathematical models really compared to some of the lines of natural catastrophe business that we know, for example. So for you, what's the relative value of contextual knowledge for something, when you're at risk selection, pricing, etc., as an underwriter?
Underwriters are often accused of being a cynical bunch, but part of the risk selection process is to think about all the ways that the risk you're considering can go wrong, as well as how that risk fits into your broader portfolio. The fact that something bad hasn't happened to a particular risk before is a relevant risk selection factor, but it's critical that we interrogate why that is and believe that it continues to be a relevant risk selection factor in the future. Historical context and imagination are critical to that process. There are data points, of course, and the correlation between food prices and the civil unrest trends all the way back to the French Revolution. Young male employment rates were significantly elevated ahead of the Arab Spring. And there are vast amounts of data out there. And that's perhaps where AI can start to be part of taking that broad historical context and starting to give us some data points to work on.
If you ask it the right questions.
If you ask it the right questions, of course. And we're working with an AI firm at the moment called Canongate AI, who built large language models that ingest, among other things, all of the State Department announcements that have ever been made. And we're looking to build those out to identify trends and inform risk selection, but not lead risk selection. That's not designed to replace the underwriter's role in that process and their ability to think about all the potential outcomes and not just what you think the most likely to least likely is, but to build your portfolio in a way that is robust throughout those possible outcomes.
You say, what is going to be the cost of this company or not, or how much insurance do you really need or don't need? And they're going to come to you and say, do I really need to buy this product? And you've got to start putting numbers, predictability numbers on things. And us observers here and us semi-political people with a lot of experience can help with putting those numbers on it, those predictions. One thing that's very important, I would argue for you, don't pay attention to the media. Media is a product, and they sell into a market. And that plus social media, understand that, as the head of one of the networks said, if it bleeds, it leads. So one thing I suggest to people is find some people who've got some long-term horizons. And then if you have to do it yourself, use a lot of media sources and don't believe anybody entirely. Let me give an example. Stock market was going down. It's the extent that people look at that as a barometer. The New York Stock Exchange, either the Dow or the NASDAQ or the S&P. It was going down as the number of days that the government was shut down. And then suddenly, when they took a vote in the Senate, procedural vote, the NASDAQ went up 500 points. Now, that is irrational. Doesn't relate to any underlying factors. That's somebody flipping a coin or looking at his Ouija board saying, oh, yeah, my gut tells me because the chicken fell a certain way this morning that I need to be buying. We have arbitrageurs that do that, and some win and some lose.
Charlie, I guess this is the value of using AI to help assess risks based on historical data. In this case, reading and analysing tons and tons of government statements to provide those indicators.
we're still in the development phase. It's predominantly the political risk and political violence market teams that are involved in that project. And there's a former underwriter at the box in Lloyd's. Part of what underwriters learn over time is it's not intuition, but it's a sense of all of these competing factors that exist at any moment in time are what are driving your judgment and your view and the way you're positioning your account. The really exciting thing for me about AI is that it gives us the technology and the capability to test those intuitions by pulling the data out and being able to present those outcomes in a format that you can manage. And underwriters just neither had the skill sets nor the time nor the resources to really do that. So there's real potential in some of these difficult specialty classes.
You've got so many different territories and quite a few lines of business as well. So you can never be a local expert. I mean, certainly in your role as a CUO internationally, it'd be a mistake to try to be a local expert, wouldn't it? You need to be able to see the wood for the trees. But I guess it's a big help having AI resources that provide that. As Robert says, if you ask the right questions, that is. But how much value do you still place on like local expertise?
Underwriter empowerment is central to the culture and purpose of Mosaic. Our underwriters are the experts in their given subject matter, and the lines of business that we've very carefully selected are non-homogeneous, are difficult to model risk, and perhaps at some stage in the future AI changes that. But we absolutely believe that the biggest determiners to outperformance to the market for the lines of business we are in is the underwriting judgment and risk selection of the teams. So it's critical that they are fully empowered. The closer they are to the business, the closer they are to our clients, the deeper, better understanding they will have of the business they're insuring. Particularly in the political risk, political violence classes of business, the teams are traveling all over the world often, and those are tremendous opportunities not only to get closer to clients by traveling with them, but by getting closer to the exposure and seeing the risk on the ground itself. As an underwriting executive team, we see our role as providing the tools to empower the underwriting teams and to ask some of those what if questions from time to time, but not to micromanage.
I would also ask whether, as you talk about traveling around, do you try to make judgments about the judgments of people running companies and organizations based in part what is this person's record? Not just they were lucky at a certain point, but in terms of the analytical approach that they take as you get to know them. I'm going to put more emphasis on George over here rather than Sarah over here, or vice versa, because they've shown that they can cope with this kind of uncertainty better than others.
The knowing our clients and understanding their track records are critically important, particularly thinking about, our political risk and political violence book, where you'll tend to be operating in historically less consistent parts of the world, people with a track record of operating successfully in those places and managing difficulties or, the electricity being off or a change of government, we would say is probably the best determinant of success outside extreme force majeure scenarios. And personally, I've been very fortunate to, personal example was traveling around the Copper Belt in Democratic Republic of Congo with a client and being able to observe and talk to them and listen to them about when things do go wrong, how do they manage it when there are challenges, how do they predict it, how do they stay close to the way the wind looks like it's blowing at any moment of time. And of course, all the knowledge, all the relationships in the world can't stop everything from happening. But ultimately, that's what we're there for as insurers.
Robert, thinking about the message of your article, the complacency we've seen in foreign policy with regard to historical understanding and what that means for the future. I mean, you make the point we've had, give or take, 40 years now of playing down history and related critical analysis in foreign policy. Do you think it's reversible, at least in the short to medium term?
Traditionally, one of the strengths of America, let's say during the Cold War, was a consensus-based. We had a consensus about containing the Soviet Union, and it became how. But we're still a consensus society. And so the struggle is to have the consensus. And one of them is there has to be a new Cold War because there's no alternative. Well, there were a bunch of people under George W. Bush and Bill Clinton who said, Russia's going to be an important country. You can't just treat it like it's going to be nothing. Then they were replaced by a bunch of people who had no framework for analysis other than binary, us versus them, new Cold War. We got ourselves a new Cold War we didn't have to have, depending on what the Russians would have done. You need to get people, find the people who are willing to cope with uncertainty and think through uncertainties and aren't looking, how do I get my next job? How do I get printed in the New York Times? If I want to do that, I better follow whatever the consensus of the day.
This is the careerism that you were talking about, isn't it?
Thank you. Careerism. And well, that's a natural human factor, but you can get in deep trouble. They used to say about Lyndon Johnson, of course, made some terrible mistakes in Vietnam. He said, I will call up 20 people. 19 will tell me what I think they're going to tell me. At 20th, they'll tell me something I didn't expect. That's the person I think I need to listen to. Get me out of my comfort zone. People don't like getting out of the comfort zone. You don't advance a career by being a radical. For example, I've been in this business a long time. I don't know anybody who predicted the end of the Cold War in the business. I've later met a number of people not in the business who predicted it because their careers did not hinge on the Cold War continuing onward. They weren't going to lose their jobs, their livelihood, if they said, are you really sure the Cold War is going to go on forever? Well, we don't want to hear from you. You go do something else. I would have thought, Charlie, in your business, you've got to find the out-of-the-box thinking people, the ones who really do it, not just say, if somebody says to you, I think out of the box, run.
I think that's what we look for to a certain degree with our clients, thinking of these classes of business. It's the people that have really good plans for investing and building a business in a place that looks very difficult to do that. And if we can sit down with them and understand how they are doing this difficult, complex, risky thing and how they have become comfortable with that and how we are sort of sharing risk rather than taking all of that risk on their behalf, then those are exactly the sorts of people we want to be doing business with. We're not really looking to predict the future. We are looking to try, with the assistance of others, think about what the range of outcomes look like, whether we can price for that, whether we can accept that risk, and what that risk looks like in terms of our broader portfolio. So there's not a single vision of the future that we are steering towards. We're trying to consider this range of outcomes and construct a portfolio that appropriately reflects that, both in terms of pricing and in terms of the amount of risk that's ultimately sitting on our and our partners' balance sheets.
So, Robert, go back to your article. You write about the problem of groupthink. Is it contrarians you want in terms of, the next generation of policymakers, but that could apply to the next generation of thinkers in any industry, really? Do you want people who are willing to be contrarian as opposed to just following, as you already said, careerism, where's my promotion coming from, follow the party line sort of thing?
I don't like the idea of contrarianism in the sense that here's a body of thought, I'm going to take the opposite view, and it might be a 50-50 chance that I'll be right. And if not, nobody's going to remember, okay, because the other side. I'm talking about people who aren't blinded by careerism, blinded by a whole series of factors, including who's paying the bills, to say, I'm going to try to look at the fundamentals. I'm going to try to draw on people who I've learned to trust. For example, in the two areas that I know a little bit about, Europe and the Middle East, I have a small group of people whose judgment I trust more than others because over time they've known what's going on. And I trust their analytical models. And I can see that they're not bound by a particular ideological perspective. Doesn't mean they were always right. But one of the things I do know is very rarely are you going to pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post, or or anyplace else and find these people talking, being quoted. The Soviet Union, God bless them, had rigidities, but they had a little letting off a steam valve called a samizdat, which is people could write for an out-of-the-way publication. It might have 1,000 readers in a country of 160 million, okay? But who cares? You let them do it. I tend to look at the people who write for the samizdat who have been pushed aside by a lot of the mainstream media because the mainstream media doesn't want to get out of the mainstream and what the advertisers are paying for. These are the people I start by saying, what does my friend Charlie have to say about this particular thing, or my friend Dave, rather than somebody who's a big name on television. I sometimes tear my hair when I see people who are on even the BBC pontificating on Gaza or something like that, and I just shake my head and say they don't do a damn thing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about China. Robert, if I could just get a very brief response from you. You've already mentioned in your article, people wrote off Russia as a great power, didn't see the return of great power politics, got things very wrong. Do you think there's similar naivete about the rise of China?
Well, I won't say naivete, but I will also pick you up on when you said rise of China. What does that mean? A rise economically, a rise.
Oh, they peaked already, I mean.
Rise militarily, a rise in terms of their appeal to outsiders, rise in terms of innovation, rise in terms of working in the Arctic, something like this. One of the problems we have, in my judgment, and I'm in a poor position to say because I'm not a China expert, we have people who understand Europe here. We all kinds of, and same in the Middle East. We're just wall to wall with them. In terms of China, we have a pretty small team of people in different areas, and they have different views. The business community is different from the buy and sell community, different from the invest community. It's different from the military community, from the foreign policy community, the cultural affairs community, the human rights community. There is no place of trying to reconcile these contending perspectives and interests in a way that you could come out and say, let's try to work out something reasonably coherent in terms of dealing with China. We do know how to deal with Europe in reasonably coherent fashion because we've had people doing it for decades. And maybe we don't have the best people now coming to the fore, being allowed to come to the fore, but it's not through lack of some people out there who understand it. With regard to China, we just don't have the trained base yet, even necessarily to ask the right questions, certainly not to come up with the right answers. And generally, relationships with countries are never one way. Even during the Cold War, we had areas in which we cooperated with the Soviet Union, like arms control. Even after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, we continued to work hand in glove with the Russians in the Arctic without a pause, because we both had to do it. There are things with regard to China we need to do, even if we're approaching a nuclear standoff someplace. So the idea that these things are just unitary, a unitary field theory in international politics is dumb.
Charlie, from an underwriting business perspective, if you're underwriting risks that are linked to China, as Robert says, these exposures are not necessarily linked, whether there might be supply chains concerned or there could be FDI issues, but one aspect of relations could continue relatively strongly while another suffers a lot, or maybe there's Belt and Road projects. What are clients most concerned about today in their relations with China?
All of the above, which is good when you're selling insurance. We've touched on it a couple of times today, but I think, that human propensity to project recent experience as a predictor for the future means I think collectively there are huge numbers of parallels being drawn between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan and then sanctions and how that outcome could happen. But, I'm absolutely not dismissing that risk. I'm just saying that that is one of a number of possible outcomes. So our job with our clients is to take a view, to take the risk away from them or share the risk with them. and then to manage our portfolios on behalf of our capacity providers.
That's a nice way to round it off. Thank you so much. It's been a really wide-ranging, fascinating discussion.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to take part.
Robert, it's been a huge privilege to share a screen with you. Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed listening to you. And Dave, thank you very much for including me in this.
That's all for another special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, in association with Mosaic Insurance. Thank you for listening, and please tune in again. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my two wonderful guests, Robert Hunter and Charlie Mackay. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.